Hi, I'm State Representative Doyle Heffley, and welcome to this edition of Legislative Report. Today we are joined by a panel of guests to talk about an issue that has been happening across the state and here in Carbon County, grandparents raising grandchildren. I'd like to introduce our guest today, and we'll get into the topic. Our first guest is Howard Grossman, who is the chair of the NEPA Intergenerational Council. Howard, thank you for joining us today.
My pleasure.
Arlie Kemmerer, a family law attorney who practices here in Carbon County. Carol Lee Boyer, who has joined us from Carbon Monroe Pike, Drug and Alcohol. And Mrs. Holly Mordaunt, the principal at L.B. Morris Elementary School in Jim Thorpe. Thank you for joining me here today, and what is a very important topic, something that we're seeing more and more throughout Carbon County and across the region is the issue of grandparents for several reasons who are getting custody of and raising their grandchildren. Obviously with the opioid and heroin epidemic raging right now across our state, there's been several pieces of legislation to address that issue, but also one of the side effects of that is the fact that a lot of parents are either incarcerated or in treatment, or unfortunately many of them have passed on from their addiction, and now those grandparents are having to step up and raise their grandchildren. So a lot of times there's a lot of questions that come with that. So we're going to talk about that today, and what could be done, or what would be the first step that a grandparent could take. Obviously, when they're approaching the topic of having to raise their grandchildren. Howard, if you could just elaborate a little bit on your office and what you do and what you would recommend.
Sure. About 12 years ago, a group of people got together in Luzerne County and decided there was a need for a coalition of organizations and agencies concerned with this growing demographic. And as you've very aptly pointed out, this is a growing phenomenon across the whole country, across the Commonwealth of Pennsylvania, certainly in northeastern Pennsylvania and the various counties like Carbon, and in our case, Luzerne. And so we formed the NEPA Intergenerational Coalition. And it meets monthly now at the Pittston Memorial Library. The library is the administrator of the regional Grandparents Raising Grandchildren program. And one of the things that we decided to do 12 years ago was to have an annual conference. And the conference is designed to bring together grandparents raising grandchildren or relative caregivers, as the case may be. And last one that we had in 2017, we had 125 people. And the first two that we had 280 people. So it's something there's a lot of interest in, and I'm so pleased that you and other state legislators are interested in this topic. Had a detailed conversation not too long ago with the Secretary of Aging in Pennsylvania, Teresa Osborne, and we talked about ways of maybe even doing a statewide conference on grandparents raising grandchildren. And the coalition that I mentioned earlier, we get referrals sometimes, or we get direct phone calls from grandparents who are concerned about a certain issue that they're facing. And it's interesting, too, to look at the demographics, because the issue is that we think these grandparents are 60 years old, 70 years old, maybe even older, but the average age, we did a little survey 4 or 5 years ago, was 47. So this is something that affects different age groups in Pennsylvania. There's at least 88,000 families in Pennsylvania where the grandparent is directly, or grandparents are directly raising grandchildren. In some cases, many more than one child. The first grandparent situation that we faced 12 years ago, it was somebody raising by herself 5 youngsters. And she had moved from Delaware into Luzerne County, and that was another whole issue, how to work 2 states together in terms of trying to help the youngsters in that case. So we get a lot of emails requests, or we get telephone requests from a grandparent or grandparents, and if we can't handle it in our office, we try and refer that out to some member of the coalition who's working. And I would add one other point, and that's we at one point had 6 support groups going in Luzerne and Lackawanna counties. And they're down to now 3 support groups, because it's very difficult for a grandparent to find the time to go out to a meeting. Now, the ones that we have 2 in Wilkes-Barre that are working very well. There's a new one in Wayne and Pike counties. It's pretty active now. They get about 10 grandparents coming out to their meetings. We have one at the Pittston Memorial Library. We're the only one that meets during the day. The other support groups meet in the evening. So the coalition, I think, has been very successful in terms of trying to bring this word to as many people as possible about the extent to which grandparents raising grandchildren exists as a growing demographic.
It certainly has become an issue. Now, Carolee, in your role with Corbin Monroe Pike, you obviously are providing those addiction treatment services to folks. So if a young family's coming in, maybe one or 2 of the parents, and they have children are dealing with addiction, is there any steps that can be taken by them as they deal with in battle with their addiction that they can do to help their children? Is there forms or things that they could set up in place before they go into treatment, or that to ensure that their children are going to be turned over to the grandparents, or make sure that their children are going to be somebody's going to be responsible to take care of them?
What we've experienced a lot is when somebody is going to be going into inpatient treatment, or they're looking to even have to turn themselves in for incarceration, is what the county seems to recognize is that if they get a notarized paper stating that the grandparents are going to be the guardians of the child, that they'll do that to ensure that the child is taken care of. If it is a single mother, we do a lot to try to encourage that single mother who needs treatment to go into a facility that is a woman and child program, so that that bond can still, be together with the mother and the child, and also that they can help gain some parenting skills. But I'm going to be honest, we're not very well versed and have a great deal of knowledge with where to turn to with these grandparents that are going to be raising the grandchildren. So I think this is something that's good, even like for my agency, and also the people that we help, where to properly guide them.
So Arlie, as an attorney, the legal standpoint. So, if a grandparent is say they're going to get custody of their grandchildren, obviously they love them and they want to take care of them and do the best by them. What are some of the first steps that they need to take? Is it a matter of ensuring that they have the proper documentation for the child with birth certificates, all those legal documents so that they can make sure that the child can get enrolled in school? But what are some of the first steps that you could recommend to a grandparent that is going to get custody of that grandchild?
The easiest process would be, as she just mentioned, having a guardianship. It's just sort of a one-sheet piece of paper it would be a notarized statement that would say, yes, I'm turning my children over to the grandparents. And that, for practical purposes, I'm going to assume for school and medical reasons, I think they accept guardianship paperwork. The issue with guardianship paperwork is you could not take it into a court and enforce it as a custody order because it's not a court order at that point. And so oftentimes what I run into 2 scenarios. We either have grandparents or other relatives. I do have aunts and uncles that have been in the same boat where they've taken custody of the children and they need something in place. They either come in advance of this, which is the easier process of, okay, my daughter is going into rehab, I'm going to take the kids. But what I also get is I get people on the back end of that when someone may be getting out of a rehab facility and they want their kids back, but maybe that's not the best decision for those kids at that point. Maybe those kids have been with that grandparent for 2 years, or when someone gets out of jail after a long period of incarceration. And so at that point it becomes, what's the best for the child? Should the child go back to the parent? Is the parent ready? Or should the grandparents be keeping this child at this point because maybe they live in different counties, in different school districts? So it would be a disruption to the child. At that point, it does become a court custody battle. And we have a lot of those right now in Carbon County. It seems like we're getting more and more of those. And it has to go through all of the custody channels just as a your standard divorce in custody case between two natural parents. It would still have to go through those same channels, and it can become pretty lengthy if it does get contentious with the children, or with the natural parents and the grandparents or aunts and uncles. So if you start that process off knowing that someone's going to be incarcerated or someone's going to go to a rehab, that doing the guardianship, you can take that guardianship paperwork into a custody proceeding, and that would be a presumption that that grandparent should have custody, and they would grant an order on that basis. And it's helpful to have that order in place if possible, and if everybody's has an agreement and understanding of what the best interest of the child would be at that point, because otherwise it can get lengthy and contentious as it goes on, because these rehab issues or incarceration issues can last years. So it's good to get out ahead of it if possible. I've also had grandparents come to me who didn't do anything. They lived with their child, their grandchild, and their child for the last 7 years, and now mom's going to jail. There's no custody paperwork in place at all. And so they know what they've been doing for the last 7 years, but the court system doesn't. And so it's like starting from scratch. So being proactive is very ideal to set yourself up for the future of that.
So definitely, if there are issues there, trying to get that some kind of paper, if it's a one-page or notarized form of guardianship, that could help in the process. At the end of the day, the focus is making sure that those children are going to be in the best care that they can, and at the same time trying to get the person that's battling with the addiction into the treatment that they can hopefully get through the addiction process and come out of treatment with a successful result.
Right, and that's the standard the court follows. Is the legal standard is what's the best interest of the children, and it's very broad, and it covers a lot of stuff. But that's the basic sort of mantra to remember: is the courts are looking to do what's in the best interest of the child, and maybe that does mean staying with the grandparents long term. It's completely situational.
Mrs. Mordaunt, now in your role as the principal at LB Morris, what are some of the things that if a grandparent now gets custody of their children, or their grandchildren, or an aunt and uncle, or another caregiver is going to be taking care of those children, what are the first steps that they would take to ensure that those children are going to be enrolled in the school? What are some of the things that they would need, and the prep work that would go into that?
Well, they would need proof of guardianship, and again, that letter would be fine, a notarized letter that the grandparents have guardianship, proof of residency, and they would need proof of the child's age. Once that occurs, they can make an appointment with our district office and complete the registration. At that point, I would recommend that they contact the school counselor and set up a meeting so that we can ensure this child has a smooth transition into our school. We have all the information we need to make the proper placements, and we can give them the best start possible.
All right. Now there are programs through the school to assist those children in their education. The Shine After School program is a wonderful program
Yes.
that helps. Obviously, the grandparents with children. Are there any specifics or things that they identify that grandparents should be looking for to help those children as they go through that transition?
Yes, we found a large number of these students do show behavioral problems, social emotional problems, and learning disabilities. So it's important to work closely with the teachers and the staff at the school to make sure we're providing the support that those students need, as well as helping the grandparents understand what they can do, because many of these grandparents haven't been in touch with the public school system for a number of years. They may not understand the use of the technology for learning and the opportunities that children have today. So it's important to work closely with the school staff.
Thank you. And we are going to take a brief intermission right now, and we'll be back with more of Legislative Report.
Milton Snavely Hershey was an American confectioner, philanthropist, and founder of the Hershey Chocolate Company, located in Hershey, Pennsylvania, home to the Great American Chocolate Bar. Milton was born September 13, 1857 in Derry Township, Pennsylvania, a town named after the second largest city in Northern Ireland, called Derry. After a 4-year apprenticeship with Royer's Ice Cream Parlor and Garden, a candy maker in Lancaster, Pennsylvania, the future chocolate king moved to Philadelphia, where he started his own candy store at the ripe old age of 18 years old. Sadly, the store went bankrupt after 6 years. Nonetheless, Milton remained undeterred. Mr. Hershey then traveled to various cities throughout the U.S., working for a variety of candy companies before moving to New York City and starting a new candy store. Sadly, this too went bankrupt after a few years. Nevertheless, he once more remained undeterred. Returning to Lancaster to try yet again, Milton started the Lancaster Caramel Company in 1886. This time he had success, with the Caramel Candy Company growing to over 1,300 employees by 1894. In 1900, he sold the Caramel Company for $1 million in cash and stock. Shortly thereafter, he broke ground in Derry Township to begin building the Hershey Chocolate Factory. Today, the Hershey Company is a multi-billion-dollar business manufacturing chocolate for chocolate lovers worldwide. Milton passed away at age 88 due to pneumonia, but his many accomplishments live on, including the Hershey Industrial School, a school for impoverished male orphans. In 1951, the school was renamed the Milton Hershey School and provides an education to all genders and all races. What ill-fated trip did Milton Hershey nearly take? A. The Hindenburg. B. The Titanic. C. The Andrea Doria. The Chocolate King wrote out a check to the White Star Line as a deposit for a stateroom on the Titanic. The Hersheys had to cancel their reservations at the last minute due to business matters and booked passage on the SS America instead.
Hi, I'm State Representative Doyle Heffley. Welcome back to this edition of Legislative Report. And we are talking about grandparents raising grandchildren, but also aunts, uncles, or anybody else that would get custody to help out family in need or to raise these children. Now, one of the topics that we had just touched on a little bit earlier in the program was the financial aspect of it. So a lot of times, grandparents or caregivers, they get the custody and they're looking for resources, whether it be to get them into school. There's also programs like Head Start, early childhood education programs that a lot of these children will qualify for. And also there could be some financial assistance through the health care or just the fact that grandparents living on their own can provide for themselves, but if they have 4 or 3 or 4 or 5 more mouths to feed, it could be a financial burden. What would some of those what's some of the paperwork or what are some of the steps that those grandparents could take? And I'll just throw it out there for anybody to start providing for those children.
I'll tell you, the Jim Thorpe School District recently hired their own social worker. So that's a wonderful contact for parents and families. They can get in touch with her. Her name is Nicole Weaver. And they can work together to fill out the necessary forms and documents that are needed to get help for these students. So that's one way that we've taken a step in the right direction. The other program that our school district has worked with is called the Homestead program through Children and Youth. And they've been wonderful in helping us secure medical treatment for children and just support for families.
All right.
I would say there's a kinship program that area agencies on aging have available. It's not a lot of money, but it's money. Nevertheless, it's a resource that grandparents can tap into. And we learned of a brand new possibility. And we had a speaker come in from the Pennsylvania Commission on Crime and Delinquency at our last conference, and that's a Victims Compensation Assistance Program. And we were advised by people who have been involved with that from a grandparent viewpoint that that's a possible source of funding because the youngsters, the children, are considered victims because they're dealing with a different supervision category. Grandparents or relative caregivers. So that's a program that should be seriously investigated. But I also think that the state of Pennsylvania should have a specialized program of financing for grandparents raising grandchildren or relative caregivers. And I know how difficult it is to get money bills, funding bills through the General Assembly. But I think this is a very important aspect, especially when you look upon the data that I mentioned earlier about 88,000 families being raised by grandparents or relative caregivers across the entire Commonwealth. So that's a big number, and I think deserves some kind of special treatment.
Definitely, there is a caucus right now, the Grandparents Raising Grandchildren Caucus, which is formed, and there's some legislation that we're looking into. One of them would deal with kinship, and if a parent of the children is going into treatment or incarceration, that there would be a trigger for kinship for the grandparents or the aunt, uncle, or somebody to get custody and provide for them. The other is through DHS looking at a navigator set up through the Department of Human Services as kind of a one-stop shop for grandparents, and that's some of the information we're trying to provide in this report here today. Now, one of the things that people are looking for state-related forms, whether they be birth certificates or anything from the state, sometimes my offices can be of assistance, or any state representative's office can be of assistance in helping to navigate that system. One of the other things is health care. Now, obviously, with the Medicaid expansion and the CHIP program here in the state, most of those folks that don't have health care would be eligible to receive some kind of health care right off the bat. Is there any advice that you could give how would a grandparent or somebody go about making sure that they have all the proper forms, and what would they need to get them enrolled in those types of programs?
Most of them already have, I think they've already had it through their parents, in my experiences. And then they just need to transfer it. I think they're able to just somehow transfer that and or just give them the cards.
Okay.
So I have not personally had any grandparents, I don't think, that have had to apply on behalf of the kids that I'm aware of.
So they're already having a health care. You had mentioned earlier about getting the children enrolled in the public school.
Yes.
And we had talked a little bit at the break about what is needed. You said a proof of age. So
Yes.
that's one thing. You want to get they want to get the children enrolled in a school. Sometimes it could be a county to county, or even as the case you spoke of earlier, out of state. But not all these children live in the same county. So what would a grandparent or a caregiver need to provide for proof of age?
If we're transferring from one school district to another, a release of records would be acceptable. That way we know where their program had left off and we can pick up the same place. If the student is new to the school system as entering kindergartner, they can have a baptismal note, they can have proof of birth from a doctor, immunizations. As long as it has their age on there, the students will be entered into the school system. And the other part that's important is just the grandparents' proof of residency. Those are the two documents that we need to enroll them in the school. And the school district will take it from there. We'll do any kind of testing, working with the grandparents and supporting the students. Another issue to look at is if the child's considered homeless or not. If it's an emergency situation, we do not require any of those documents if a child is homeless.
Okay. And just to touch on one more subject, and Arlie, you had said about making sure that there's some kind of legal document in place for if anything should happen to the caregiver. And maybe you could just elaborate on that a little bit about what they can do to prepare that, God forbid, something happens to the people that are caring for the children, that there would be something in place to make sure that those children are going to receive the care they need.
Sure. So if a grandparent or other family member would have custody, so that would be something that the court granted to them via a court order, and if they were granted primary custody or sole legal custody, which would be their decision-making powers, then it would be in their best interest to do some estate planning work, to have a will drawn up, to assign guardianship for those children in the event that something does happen to them, because given that they are going to be older, it's always good to have those things in place regardless, but it would be even more important at that point, because we would need to know if something were to happen where that child would end up going. And if there was no directive in place and the parents were not an option at that point in time, then the children would likely be placed in the children and youth system and become dependent for some length of time. So in order to avoid that potentially happening, having estate planning documents drawn up, having a will drawn up that assigns guardianship would take care of that.
So we touched on a lot of subjects. We have a little bit of time left in the program here today. But I guess first and foremost, we talked a little bit about, what the grandparents or the aunt and uncle or they're going to get custody could do. And it seems like one of the things is to try to pre-plan. If a parent is struggling and dealing with an addiction issue, they want to go get the help that they need, and recovery is an option. Recovery is possible, and it can work, and they can get their lives back on track. But if that parent would take that preparation and time to get that document turned over to who they would believe would be the guardian of their children at the time when they're going to get the help that they need. That's one of the keys to really making this as smooth a transition as possible for the children. And there's also programs in the school that are accessible. And also there are public assistance programs, and sometimes a lot of grandparents, people come to our office looking, they have their grandchildren, they're raising them. Maybe they never signed up for public benefits before in their life, and it's something that they're very proud of. However, at this point, those programs are out there to ensure that those children have the resources, the health care that they need. That's why these programs are out there. This isn't, this is kind of a hand-up program. That's what they're designed to do. And I would encourage folks that are in that situation to take a look at what those options are. A lot of folks that are retired, they have their nest egg, they have their 401k, and they're set aside to take care of themselves. But if they start using that money up front, it's going to place an additional burden on them going forward to stay in their house, and that's what they need, that stability. So we'll flash some numbers across the screen for the public assistance offices here in Carbon County, so the grandparents or whoever is getting custody can reach out to them as well. You can always stop in our office here as well. But we have a few minutes left. Any final notes as to what recommendations or advice you would give to somebody who's going to be receiving kinship?
I'd just like to mention one factor, and that sometimes we think about grandparents just by themselves raising grandchildren or a relative caregiver. But there are situations where the biological parent is still living in that household, maybe coming out of incarceration, or maybe not having been incarcerated, just living there. And so the grandparent or the relative caregiver has to worry about the biological parent as well as the grandchildren. And I think when we start talking about pre-planning and doing the right thing, that's another factor that needs to be taken into account.
I would also say that the Carbon County Bar Association has a legal referral service that you can call into them if you're looking for an attorney that can give you a hand with navigating the court system regarding this issue. I highly recommended to contact an attorney about it so that you're not contacting us on the back end when something got really complicated. So doing it up front would definitely save a lot of trouble in the long run.
And my recommendation, because the opiate epidemic is so bad, not only in the country, the state, but also in our county, is that for grandparents, of these children, parents of people who have the disease of addiction, to be proactive. Like you said about not coming on the back end, but it would be a good conversation to have of, okay, the statistics are the longer you use, the greater you increase your chances of dying of an overdose. So what's going to happen to your child? What's going to happen to, my grandchild? To have something, in place prior to that happening instead of, being reactive after, the tragedy occurs.
Thank you, Carol Lee. And that's about all the time we have for this edition of Legislative Report. Tune in next month as we continue this topic.